You're standing on a train platform. The air smells of coal smoke and rain-soaked wood. Children everywhere, thousands of them, pressed against windows, clutching small cloth bundles. Their eyes are empty, not sad, empty, like they've forgotten how to remember. Now imagine this. It's not one train, it's hundreds. Not one city. Dozens, not one year, decades. And nobody, not one record, not one letter, not one desperate mother's plea, explains where the parents went. Over 250,000 children, shipped west on orphan trains between 1854 and 1929. The official story calls it charity, a rescue operation, saving street urchins from squalor. But the children weren't orphans, and somebody knew exactly what they were doing when they erased the parents from history. The basement of the New York Public Library smells like paper slowly becoming dust. I'd been there for 3 weeks, chasing a footnote in an 1889 welfare report. The footnote mentioned irregular documentation procedures in the Children's Aid Society, intake records from 1856 to 1875, irregular. That's the word that wouldn't leave me alone. I requested box 247, catalog series CAS 1856. The archivist brought it on a cart, the cardboard box sagging with age. Inside, intake forms, thousands of them, each one recording a child's name, approximate age, condition, upon arrival, and, supposedly, parental status. I opened the first folder, March 1856, a boy named Thomas, age 7. The form had blanks for mother's name, father's name, reason for surrender. All 3 lines were filled in the same handwriting, the same ink, but the answers made no sense. Mother's name, removed per Protocol 7. Father's name, removed per Protocol 7 reason, for surrender. Parental records sealed by municipal order. I blinked. Read it again, checked the next form. A girl named Catherine, age 5, same handwriting, same 3 answers. Protocol 7, sealed by municipal order. 20 forms in. I stopped counting. Every single one. Same stamp of bureaucratic deletion. Same careful excision of family origin. I opened another folder. 1862, same pattern. 1867, same deletion. By the time I reached 1875, my hands were shaking. Not one parent named. Not one address given. Not one story of poverty or surrender or tragic death. Just Protocol 7 repeated 20,000 times. I sat back. The archive was silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Here was the evidence. Children processed like goods, parents erased like they'd never existed, and a protocol number that appeared nowhere else in the historical record. You don't erase parents by accident, and you don't do it 20,000 times unless you're hiding something enormous. The Children's Aid Society was founded in 1853 by Charles Loring Brace, a minister who looked at New York's crowded immigrant neighborhoods and saw what he called street Arabs, children without proper homes. His solution was simple: send them west on trains to farming families who needed labor. That's the official story. Clean, charitable, progressive for its time. But look at the first train. March 1854. 46 children departed Grand Central Depot heading for Dowie Jack, Michigan. Contemporary newspaper accounts described them as orphaned and vagrant. But there's a problem. I found the intake records for 32 of those 46 children. Not one was listed as orphaned in their original paperwork. Instead, each record showed temporary placement or voluntary surrender during family hardship. There were addresses, tenement buildings on Mulberry Street, Cherry Street, Baxter Street. There were dates of expected parental retrieval, mother to return by May, or father expected when employment secured. These weren't orphans. They were children placed in temporary care with the explicit expectation they'd be reclaimed. But they never were. I cross-referenced the addresses. Every single tenement building listed in those intake forms was demolished between March and June of 1854, not through fire or structural collapse, through coordinated municipal demolition. Entire city blocks erased. The timing was perfect. Children taken into care, buildings destroyed, parents scattered with no forwarding address recorded. And then the trains started running. The children were told their parents had signed surrender papers. The parents, those who could be found later, claimed they'd signed temporary care agreements. But the papers each side saw were different. The bureaucratic sleight of hand was brilliant. Child separated from parent. Paperwork contradictory. Buildings demolished. Population dispersed. By the time anyone questioned the process, the children were already 1,000 miles away. The train arrived in Dowagiac on March 12, 1854. Reverend E.P. Smith documented the scene in a letter to his daughter, now held at the Michigan Historical Society. He'd gone to observe the charitable work of the Children's Aid Society. What he witnessed made him physically ill. The children were lined up on the platform, he wrote, clean but terrified. Farmers walked among them, examining teeth and hands, feeling their arms for strength. One man lifted a boy by the shoulders to test his weight. Another asked a girl of perhaps 6 to read from a card. When she could not, he moved on to the next child. It was not unlike the slave markets I witnessed in my youth, before abolition. The language was different, but the assessment was the same. Can this child work? Will this child be worth the cost of feeding? 3 children were returned to the train. Too small, too sickly, not worth the investment. The remaining 43 were dispersed to local farms within an hour. Smith tried to interview the farmers. Most refused to speak with him. One, a man named Josiah Wheaton, told him bluntly, "We were told these children have no people, no claims upon them. We pay no adoption fee. We provide room and board in exchange for farm labor until they reach majority. It's a fair trade." Smith asked about education. Wheaton laughed. "Children learn by working," he said. Smith asked what happened when the children came of age. Wheaton shrugged. "They're free to go wherever they please, if they want." 2 months later, Smith returned to Dowagiac to check on the children. He could only locate 9 of the original 43. When he asked about the others, he was told they'd been moved to other placements or had run off. No records existed of where they'd gone. One girl, Sarah, age 8, was still there. She was working in the Wheaton kitchen when Smith arrived. He asked her about her mother. She looked at him with those empty eyes and said, "I don't remember having a mother." 2 months, that's how long it took to erase a child's memory of family. I found the next piece in Philadelphia's city archives, an 1856 report from the Philadelphia House of Refuge, an institution that provided temporary shelter for children before they were sent west. The report contained a curious paragraph buried on page 47. "We continue to experience difficulties with parents attempting to reclaim children after placement on Western trains. Despite signed surrender documents, many parents claim they were told the arrangement was temporary. To prevent confusion and emotional distress, we have implemented new procedures. All parental contact information is now sealed upon intake. Release of this information requires municipal court order and demonstrable proof of parental fitness." Think about that language. Sealed upon intake, proof of fitness required, not proof of identity fitness. The bureaucracy wasn't protecting children from unfit parents. It was preventing any parents, fit or not, from ever finding their children again. I requested the court records for parental reclamation attempts in Philadelphia between 1856 and 1870. The archives clerk looked at me strangely. "Those records were destroyed," she said. "Water damage in 1923. All of them?" I asked. "All the records related to orphan train placement. Just those records. Nothing else from that period. Only the documentation that might prove parents were searching for their children. Water damage." That's what they called it. At the Massachusetts State Archives, I found something that made my stomach turn. A memo from the Boston Children's Service Bureau, dated October 1862. It concerned the naming crisis, an administrative problem that had emerged as orphan train operations expanded. The problem was simple. Too many children arrived with the same names. Common Irish names like Mary, Patrick, Bridget, Thomas. The Bureau couldn't keep them straight in their records. Children were being placed, but the paperwork was becoming confused. Some children were being recorded under the wrong names. Others weren't being recorded at all. The solution, proposed by Bureau Director Alpheus Hardy, was elegant. All children upon intake shall be assigned new given names according to alphabetical intake order. Surnames shall be standardized to reflect receiving institution. Prior names shall be noted in sealed records, but shall not be used in placement documentation. They renamed them. Every child, new first name, new last name, the old names sealed away in records that required court orders to access. Imagine being 7 years old, torn from your family, sent 1,000 miles west, and when you arrive, even your name is gone. You're not Patrick O'Brien anymore, you're Samuel Brace. Your entire identity, the one thing your mother gave you, erased with a pen stroke. The memo included statistics. Between 1862 and 1868, the Boston Bureau renamed 4,217 children. The sealed records containing their original names were kept in a separate archive facility. That facility burned in 1872 accidental fire, according to the insurance report. Complete loss of contents. 4,000 children. Names erased. Records burned. If you wanted to find your child after that, you'd need to recognize them by sight alone, assuming you even knew where the trains had taken them. I found Margaret Doyle's letters at the Missouri Historical Society. 17 of them, written between 1867 and 1874. Each one sent to a different orphanage, children's society. or municipal office, each one asking the same question: where is my daughter? Her daughter, Catherine, was 8 when she was placed in temporary care at the St. Louis Home for the Friendless in January 1867. Margaret's husband had died in a railway accident. She was working as a seamstress but couldn't afford childcare. The home promised to keep Catherine until Margaret found stable housing. In March, Margaret secured a position with room and board. She went to retrieve Catherine. The home told her Catherine had been placed with a family in the Western Territories. They wouldn't say where. When Margaret insisted, they showed her a paper, supposedly signed by her surrendering Catherine permanently. Margaret couldn't read well, but she knew what she'd signed. It was a temporary care agreement. 3 months, not permanent surrender. She spent the next 7 years writing letters. She wrote to the Children's Aid Society in New York. She wrote to the Kansas City Mission. She wrote to sheriffs in Iowa and Nebraska and Missouri. She wrote to governor's offices. She wrote to churches. Here's what came back: silence or careful bureaucratic deflection. Records from that period are incomplete. Without the child's placement name, we cannot assist. Parental claims must be verified through municipal court, and required documentation we are not at liberty to provide. In 1873, Margaret hired a lawyer. He filed a petition in St. Louis Circuit Court demanding the release of Catherine's placement records. The court ruled that Margaret's parental rights had been legally terminated through her surrender signature, even though Margaret maintained she'd never signed such a document. The final letter I found was dated March 1874. Margaret writing to the St. Points of Four. Margaret writing to the St. Louis Superintendent of Charities. I know my daughter is alive somewhere. I know she is wondering why I never came for her. Please tell me where she is. I will travel any distance. I will take any work. I only want to hold her again and tell her I never stopped looking. There's no record of a response. Margaret Doyle died in 1879, cholera. She was 41. In the effects auction after her death, someone bought a small bundle of letters. The same 17 letters, kept and reread so many times. The paper had worn so feet. Catherine was never found. Margaret's case was not unique. The Missouri archives contain 47 similar petition attempts between 1867 and 1890. Not one resulted in a child being returned. By 1870, the orphan train system had expanded to dozens of cities. Chicago was a major collection point, processing thousands of children annually. The Chicago Foundling Home, established in 1869, worked in coordination with the Children's Aid Society to fill trains heading west. I found their annual reports at the Newberry Library, dry statistical documents listing intake numbers, placement rates, and operational costs. But buried in the 1870 report was a peculiar table. Origin of children by parental status. Orphaned, both parents deceased. 14% half-orphaned, one parent deceased. 11% abandoned. 8% temporary surrender. 67%. Think about that last number. 67%. More than 2/3 of the children sent west from Chicago were surrendered temporarily, meaning parents expected to reclaim them, but the placement rate was 100%. Every child, regardless of parental status, was placed on trains and sent west. The documentation made no distinction between true orphans and temporary surrenders. I cross-referenced the Chicago figures with records from New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and St. Louis. The pattern was identical in every city. New York 1868, 71% temporary surrenders, 100% placement rate. Philadelphia 1872, 64% temporary surrenders, 100% placement rate. Boston 1873, 69% temporary surrenders, 100% placement rate. The system was systematically converting temporary care into permanent separation. Parents were told one thing, records showed another, and the children disappeared into the vast American interior. What made Chicago particularly interesting was a note at the bottom of the 1870 report. We continue to receive inquiries from parents seeking children previously in our care. Per Protocol 7, all such inquiries are referred to municipal authorities. We maintain no records of post-placement whereabouts. Protocol 7. There it was again. The same bureaucratic code I'd seen in New York. The same systematic erasure of family connections. And it was coordinated across cities, across states, across decades. The trains themselves should have left documentation. Manifests, destination records, arrival confirmations. That's how railroads worked. Every cargo documented, every passenger recorded. But the orphan trains were different. I spent 2 weeks at the Union Pacific Railroad Museum in Council Bluffs, Iowa. They have extensive archives from the 1860s to 1880s, freight manifests, passenger lists, maintenance logs. But orphan train records are almost entirely absent. I found 3 partial manifests from 1876, trains carrying children from Chicago to settlements in Iowa and Nebraska. The manifests listed children by number, not name. Cargo 47 units. Type juvenile labor placements. Destination distributed en route. Distributed en route. That was the system. The train didn't go to one destination. It stopped at towns along the way. At each stop, children were displayed, selected, dispersed. No central record of who got off where. No documentation of which child went to which family. The railroad wasn't creating an adoption record. It was creating a distribution network designed to make children untraceable. I asked the museum archivist if there were more complete orphan train records elsewhere. She shook her head. Most were never kept in the first place. The Children's Aid Society didn't want detailed records, made reclamation claims harder. So if a parent wanted to find their child, they'd need to know which train, which date, and then travel to every town along that route asking if anyone remembered a child with that description. And by that time, the child might have been moved again, or renamed, or simply worked to exhaustion on a farm, miles from any town. It was a system designed to disappear children, and it worked perfectly. Nebraska, 1878. The selection process. I found William Morrison's diary at the Nebraska State Historical Society. Morrison was a schoolteacher in Hastings, Nebraska. In October 1878, he attended an orphan train arrival out of curiosity. His description is chilling in its detail. The train arrived at 2 p.m. 40 children, ages perhaps 5 to 14, were unloaded onto the platform. They had been traveling for 3 days. Some were crying. Most stood in silence, gripping small bundles. The agent from the Children's Aid Society lined them up. Local families arrived. Farmers, shopkeepers, a few town families. They walked along the line examining children. It reminded me of nothing so much as horse trading. People discussed the children's merits and defects openly, while the children stood there listening. That one's too small for field work. This one looks sickly. Can you read? No? A girl of perhaps 9 was asked to sing. She refused. The prospective family moved on. Another child, a boy of 12, was examined by a farmer who squeezed his arms and made him jump to demonstrate coordination. Satisfied, the farmer signed papers with the agent. The boy was told to get in the wagon. He asked where they were going. The farmer said, home. The boy asked if someone would write to his mother. The farmer said there was no mother. The boy insisted there was. The farmer struck him lightly and said, no more talk about that. Morrison watched 23 children selected that day. 17 remained. The agent told them they'd continue to the next town. Morrison asked what happened to children nobody wanted. The agent said they'd keep traveling until they found placement, or they'd be sent to an institutional home out west. Morrison never specified where out west meant, and I haven't found any records of institutional homes receiving these excess children, which raises an uncomfortable question. What actually happened to the children nobody wanted? At the Library of Congress, I found the Children's Aid Society's promotional photograph collection. Hundreds of images from the 1880s and 1890s showing successfully placed children on farms, in workshops, with new families. But something was wrong with the photographs. I requested high-resolution scans and examined them under magnification. At least 40% showed evidence of physical editing, not digital manipulation, but careful brushwork done directly on the photographic plates or prints. In one image from 1884, labeled Adopted Child with New Family, Iowa, you can see the brush strokes around the edges of the child's figure. Someone had painted out something, or someone standing behind the child. In another, successful placement, Kansas, 1887, the background shows a barn, but the barn door has been carefully retouched. Under magnification, you can see original shading suggesting someone stood in that doorway. They've been removed. Why edit promotional photographs? I studied the patterns. Children were always alone or with adult figures identified as adoptive parents. But in several photos, you can see shadows that don't match the visible figures. In others, there's extra space in the composition, as if someone was cropped out. I showed the photos to a photography historian at the Smithsonian. She examined them carefully. These edits removed people, she confirmed. You can see it in the lighting and shadow patterns. Someone was in these photos originally and was deliberately removed in post-processing. Who, based on the positioning and shadow angles? I'd guess other children, maybe siblings. The removal was systematic. Any photo showing children in groups was edited to show them alone or with adult figures only. Why would you remove siblings from promotional photos unless you were hiding the fact that siblings were being separated? Unless you didn't want visual evidence that families were being broken apart? The promotional materials showed happy, singular orphans, finding new homes. The edited-out shadows suggested the actual story was children torn from brothers and sisters, then photographed to erase any evidence of that severing. I found the death certificates at the Kansas Historical Society. Between 1880 and 1900, the state recorded 247 deaths of placed children. Children identified in records as having arrived via orphan trains or similar placement systems. Their ages at death, mostly between 9 and 16. Causes of death: work-related accidents, 89 exhaustion/malnutrition, 52 untreated illness, 44 exposure, 31 other, 31 one death certificate. From 1889 caught my attention. A boy named Samuel, surname listed as unknown, age 14, cause of death, crushed by farm equipment. Location: rural Barton County. The physician's note included a detail. Boy was operating machinery alone, against state labor restrictions. Employer claims boy misrepresented age as 16. Evidence suggests boy was no more than 12 years actual age. Farm owner assessment of age appears deliberately false. The coroner declined to file charges. The farm owner's name was recorded, but no investigation followed. I cross-referenced the death records with contemporary Kansas newspaper accounts. Almost none of the child deaths were reported in papers. The exceptions were cases where multiple children died at once. A barn fire that killed 3 placed children in 1885, a typhoid outbreak at a boarding house holding 12 orphan-trained children in 1891. But individual deaths, one child at a time, went unrecorded in public memory. I found one exception. An 1890 letter to the editor in the Topeka Daily Capital, signed only as a Christian woman. I have witnessed the treatment of children placed in our county through the orphan system. These children work from dawn until dark. They sleep in barns or unheated sheds. They are beaten for slowness or error. One child at a neighboring farm, a girl of no more than 11, collapsed in the field last week from exhaustion. When I attempted to intervene, I was told the child was lazy and uncooperative. The child died 2 days later. No inquest was held. No crime was recorded. The farmer has already requested another child from the next train. How is this different from slavery? At least slaves had monetary value that protected them from casual death. These children are replaceable. If one dies, another train will bring more. No response to the letter was ever published. The death rate I found, 247 recorded deaths in 20 years in one state, is almost certainly an undercount. These were only the deaths that reached official documentation. How many children died without anyone recording their names or causes? How many were buried in unmarked graves on remote farms with no witnesses? And how many parents spent the rest of their lives not knowing their child died alone, far from home, worked to death by strangers? In the National Archives, I found reference to something that shouldn't exist. The Federal Bureau for Child Migration Coordination. The Bureau existed from 1887 to 1893, 6 years. It appears in exactly 4 documents: a congressional appropriations record from 1887, 2 interagency memos from 1891, and a dissolution notice from 1893. Its stated purpose: coordination of interstate juvenile placement protocols and maintenance of federal oversight for child welfare migration programs. Translation: federal supervision of the orphan train system. But here's the thing: no other records from this bureau survive. No reports, no correspondence, no policy documents, nothing about what coordination meant or what oversight entailed. I filed a FOIA request for any surviving Federal Bureau for Child Migration Coordination records. The National Archives response came back 6 weeks later. Our search has found no responsive documents. Records from this agency were not transferred to NARA Holdings upon agency dissolution. Where did 6 years of federal records go? I found one clue in an 1892 memo from the Office of Indian Affairs, now Bureau of Indian Affairs. The memo referenced ongoing coordination with Bureau for child migration regarding placement of juvenile subjects in Western Territories under federal jurisdiction. Western Territories. Federal jurisdiction, that's Indian Territory. Reservations. Were orphan-trained children being placed on reservations? I searched for records of child placements in Indian Territory during the 1880s to 1890s. I found scattered references in Mission Society reports of white children in Indian schools and juvenile settlers on reservation lands, but no systematic records, no names, no numbers. The Indian boarding school system of that era is well documented, a brutal assimilation program that took native children from their families. But were they also using those schools to disappear white children that nobody was looking for? I don't have enough evidence to prove it, but the timing matches. The bureaucratic structure existed, and the same pattern of document destruction follows the thread: federal involvement, coordination across states, systematic record elimination. This wasn't just charity work gone wrong. This was a program someone was managing from the top. The Des Moines Register published a story on June 12, 1898, that I almost missed. Buried on page 7, the headline read, "Woman's Search for Son Ends in Heartbreak." The story. Anna Kowalski had spent 14 years searching for her son, Joseph, who had been placed on an orphan train from New York in 1884 when he was 6 years old. Anna's husband had died. She'd been unable to work and care for Joseph simultaneously. She was told the placement was temporary. She never saw him again. In 1898, Anna finally received word that a man matching Joseph's age and description was working on a farm near Des Moines. She traveled from New York, her first time leaving the city, to find him. The newspaper recorded the encounter. Mrs. Kowalski approached the young man as he worked in the field. She called to him in Polish. He looked up, confused. She asked if he was Joseph Kowalski. The young man said his name was Joseph Brace, and he'd been raised on this farm since childhood. Mrs. Kowalski showed him a photograph, herself holding an infant. She told him she was his mother. The young man studied the photograph. He said he remembered no mother. The farm owner appeared and told Mrs. Kowalski to leave. She begged to speak with her son. The young man said nothing. As she was escorted from the property, Mrs. Kowalski asked her son if he remembered anything of New York, of their home on Orchard Street, of the song she used to sing him. The young man paused, then shook his head. "I'm sorry," he said. "I think you've made a mistake." Anna returned to New York. She died 3 years later. Here's the question that haunts me. Was it really Joseph? The newspaper doesn't say. The description matched. The age matched. But 14 years had passed. The boy had become a man, and he'd been renamed. And he'd spent his entire conscious memory being told he had no mother. Even if it was Joseph, he couldn't admit it. Not with the farm owner standing there. Not after a lifetime of being told his previous life was a lie. The psychological erasure might have been more complete than any document destruction. By 1900, the Children's Aid Society proudly reported it had placed over 120,000 children. Other organizations, the New York Foundling Hospital, the Boston Children's Mission, the Philadelphia House of Refuge, dozens of smaller regional societies, added at least another 130,000, 250,000 children, minimum. Most were listed in contemporary records as orphans. But if you drill into the intake documentation that survived, the fragments that didn't burn, weren't sealed, didn't disappear, you find the same pattern everywhere. 70% were temporary surrenders. That means somewhere between 150,000 and 175,000 children were taken from parents who expected to get them back, and almost none ever did. I tried to calculate the number of parents actively searching. I found records of 1,247 documented search attempts, petitions filed, letters written, agencies contacted, but those are only the searches that left paper trails. Most parents were illiterate, poor, had no access to lawyers, didn't know which agencies to contact, didn't speak English as a primary language. For every documented search, how many parents simply had no way to begin, looking bold, and how many gave up after being told their children didn't exist, didn't want to be found, had been legally given away. The grief of 150,000 families, deliberately created. The childhood memories of 150,000 people, systematically erased. The family connections of 150,000 individuals, permanently severed. That's not a charity program. That's demographic manipulation. But manipulation toward what purpose? I found a court case at the Minnesota Historical Society that suggests one possible answer. Jameson v. Jameson, 1904. The case involved a farm inheritance dispute. Michael Jameson, a farmer who died in 1903, had left his 240-acre property to his son, Robert Jameson, but Michael's brother contested the will, claiming Robert was not Michael's biological son, and therefore had no legitimate inheritance claim. The case revealed Robert had arrived via orphan train in 1877 as a child of approximately 6. Michael and his wife Margaret, who died in 1895, had no biological children. They'd selected Robert from a train and raised him as their son, but they'd never legally adopted him. Minnesota had no formal adoption law until 1917. Robert had simply been placed with them, given their surname, and raised as their child. Michael's brother argued that without legal adoption, Robert had no inheritance rights. Robert countered that he'd worked the farm for 27 years and had every reasonable expectation of inheritance. The court ruled against Robert because he'd never been legally adopted, and because no blood relationship existed, he had no claim to the property. The farm went to Michael's brother. Here's the detail that caught my attention. The court record included testimony from a Children's Aid Society representative. He was asked if the society kept records of children's biological parents. He answered such records, if they existed, would be sealed. We cannot confirm or deny family connections for children. Placed 27 years ago. Robert's lawyer then asked if the sealed records could be opened to establish whether Michael and Margaret might have been distant relatives of Robert's biological family, which might establish some inheritance claim. The representative's answer, the records from that period no longer exist in accessible form. Robert lost a 240-acre farm because the organization that had taken him from his original family had also destroyed any record of who that family was. He couldn't prove biological connection to the Jamesons, and he couldn't prove he had no other family with potential inheritance claims. The orphan train system had made him legally nobody. How many other inheritance disputes followed this pattern? How much land, how much property, how much wealth was redirected because placed children couldn't prove identity or family connection? And was that part of the plan? Remove children from immigrant families who might accumulate property, place them with farmers who needed labor but not necessarily heirs, and ensure the children could never claim inheritance by destroying their documentation? It would explain why the records were so systematically destroyed. Not just to prevent parents from finding children, but to prevent children, once grown, from claiming any legal rights or family connections. The last documented orphan train ran in 1929. The system didn't end because of scandal or exposure. It ended because the need disappeared. By 1929, every state had compulsory education laws. Child labor laws had been passed. Social welfare programs were emerging. The progressive era had created new systems for dealing with childhood poverty. But more than that, the demographic work was done. The immigrant neighborhoods that had produced most of the orphan train children, Irish, Italian, Polish, German, had been dispersed or assimilated. The children of those communities had been scattered across the country. The family structures that might have maintained cultural continuity had been deliberately broken. The last train carried 3 children from New York to Texas. No newspaper coverage, no ceremony. The system simply stopped. The Children's Aid Society continued operating under different programs. The archived records were gradually sealed or destroyed through the 1930s and 1940s. By 1950, most of the detailed placement records were gone. Today, the Children's Aid Society acknowledges the orphan train program existed. They call it a well-intentioned effort with mixed results. They maintain a small archive of photographs and general records, but specific placement data, which child went where from which family, with what original name, is almost entirely absent. They say the records were lost to time and inadequate archival practices. But I've seen the patterns. The fires always in the right years. The water damage always hitting the right file boxes. The administrative decisions to seal first, then destroy. You don't lose records like that by accident. In the 1960s and 70s, as the last orphan train riders reached old age, some began speaking publicly. A few wrote memoirs. Most didn't. Those who did speak often struggled to remember details. They'd been so young when taken. The trauma of separation had fractured memory. Many had been told their parents were dead, or didn't want them, or had given them away, permanently. Those lies became their histories. But some remembered. I found an interview from 1972 with a woman named Eleanor who'd been placed from New York to Kansas in 1904 at age 5. She was 73 during the interview, conducted by a local historical society. Interviewer: do you remember your family in New York? Eleanor: I remember my mother. I remember my mother. She had dark hair. She sang to me. There was a small room with a window that looked out at other buildings. I remember the smell of bread baking. Interviewer: did you ever try to find her? Eleanor: long pause. When I was 16, I tried. I didn't know her last name. I'd been renamed when I was placed. I didn't know the address. I didn't know how to start. I wrote to the Children's Aid Society. They wrote back saying they had no record of me. Interviewer: no record? Eleanor: that's what they said. I gave them the farm family's name, my current name. The year I arrived, they said their records from that period were incomplete. They couldn't help me. Interviewer: how did that make you feel? Eleanor, crying. Like I'd imagined her. Like she was a dream I'd had. Like I'd never existed before I got off that train. The interview ended there. Eleanor's experience was common among the riders who tried to search. The organizations that had taken them now claimed they didn't exist in the records, or the records were sealed, or required legal processes too expensive for people who'd grown up in farm labor. The system had done its work too well. Even when the children remembered, even when they tried to find their origins, the documentary erasure was complete. Last month, I submitted a formal research request to the Children's Aid Society's successor organization. I asked for access to any surviving intake records from 1854 1929 that might contain original family information for placed children. The response came back within 3 days. Thank you for your research inquiry. Due to privacy concerns, and in accordance with New York State regulations, we cannot provide access to individual intake records. Aggregate statistical data is available in our published histories. We appreciate your understanding that protection of individual privacy remains our priority, even for historical records. I wrote back explaining that most of the individuals in question would be deceased, having been born 170 years ago. I noted that privacy concerns might be overridden by research value. Second response: we maintain our privacy protocols for all client records, regardless of age. Additionally, many records from the period you're researching were not preserved due to storage limitations and fire damage in the early 20th century. We cannot provide documents that no longer exist. Fire damage, storage limitations, privacy protocols. The same language, the same barriers, 100 years later, and the system is still hiding the evidence. What we can't know. Here's what I can't prove. What the missing records prevent anyone from proving. Were the children actually orphans? The intake forms that survive suggest no. Most were temporary surrenders, but the forms that might confirm this were systematically destroyed. Where exactly did each child go? Train manifests don't exist in detail. Placement records are sealed or gone. Even surviving children often didn't know their exact placement location. What happened to the parents? No database tracks the families left behind. No records document their searches, their grief, their questions. They exist only as ghostly signatures on surrender papers that may have been falsified. How many children died in placement? The death certificates I found are fragmentary. Most child deaths on rural farms went unrecorded. No agency tracked mortality among placed children. Was this coordinated at a federal level? The Federal Bureau for Child Migration existed but left no accessible records. The systematic nature of record destruction across multiple states suggests coordination, but the evidence was erased. What happened to children nobody wanted? The ones rejected at multiple stops, deemed too old or too weak or too difficult. Records suggest institutional homes out west, but I can't find those institutions in surviving records. Were siblings deliberately separated? The edited photographs suggest yes. Contemporary accounts occasionally mention keeping families together as an exception, implying separation was the rule. But systematic documentation is absent. How much inherited wealth was redirected? Court cases like Jamison v. Jamison hint at this, but how common was it? The legal documentation would exist in scattered county courthouses, unfindable without specific names and dates. Who designed this system? Charles Loring Brace gets credit as founder, but the bureaucratic sophistication, the coordinated record destruction across multiple states and organizations suggests something larger. Committee? Government directive? Philanthropic conspiracy? The organizing documents don't survive. 6 unanswered questions. First, why rename the children? If this was genuinely about charity and adoption, why systematically erase their original names? What purpose did that serve besides making them untraceable? Second, why was Protocol 7 never explained or documented anywhere outside the intake forms themselves? What was the actual protocol? Who created it? Why did it appear in multiple cities simultaneously? Third, why were the fires and record destruction so perfectly timed? The records that burned always covered the exact periods when parental reclamation attempts were most common. That's not coincidence. That's purpose. Fourth, what happened to the Federal Bureau for Child Migration Coordination's 6 years of records? Federal agencies don't just disappear without leaving paper trails, unless someone actively eliminates those trails. Fifth, why do contemporary photographs show evidence of systematic editing to remove figures, likely siblings, from images of placed children? Who authorized that editing and why? Sixth, if this was about rescuing children from poverty, why did the system continue operating in periods of economic prosperity? The trains kept running through boom years when poverty rates declined. Why continue if poverty wasn't the actual motivation? These questions have no answers because the evidence was deliberately destroyed. That destruction is itself the clearest evidence of intent. Last September, I took a train from New York to Des Moines, following one of the original Orphan train routes. I wanted to stand in the spaces where this happened. Grand Central Terminal in New York is beautiful now. Restored marble, soaring windows, crowds of tourists. But if you go down to the lower levels, to the old track platforms that aren't used anymore, you can still find them. The walls have rings bolted into them, low to the ground. For tying up luggage, they'll tell you, but the spacing is wrong for luggage. The bolts are lower than you'd need for bags. They're at a height for small wrists. I found them at other stations too. Chicago Union Station, St. Louis, Little steel rings, rusted now, that nobody thinks about. At the Hastings, Nebraska station, now a museum, there's a photograph on the wall from 1880. 9 children lined up on the platform. If you look carefully at their wrists, in some of the photos you can see marks, thin bruises, the kind rope leaves. Nobody at the museum could tell me why the children might have been restrained. Maybe to keep them from running. One volunteer suggested, long journey, you know. Children get restless, but you don't tie children up unless you think they'll run, and you don't think they'll run unless they don't want to be where they're going. I asked the volunteer if the museum had records of which children came through Hastings. She showed me a ledger book, names, ages, dates, but no origin information, no family names, nothing about where they came from, or what happened to them after they left the platform. Do people ever come here searching? I asked, for family history? Sometimes. Usually they don't find much. The building remembers, the steel rings remember, but the records don't, because someone made sure they wouldn't, the grief that has no name. There should be a word for the specific grief of losing a child to bureaucratic erasure, not death, where grief has ritual, has finality, has proof. Not kidnapping, where there's a crime to prosecute, a villain to blame, but something else, something worse, in its quiet, legal, systematic thoroughness. The parents who signed temporary care papers and never saw their children again. They lived with this. They went to work. They walked past the tenement rooms where their children used to sleep. They heard other people's children playing in the street. And they knew, somewhere, their child was alive, growing up, forgetting them. That grief has no ritual, no funeral, no grave to visit. Just the endless, unresolvable not knowing. And the children who grew up renamed, retold, erased, they carried a different grief, the sense that something was missing, that their memories didn't fit their stories, that the parents they half remembered might still be looking, might be grieving, might never know what happened to them. How do you mourn someone who's been bureaucratically disappeared? The orphan train system created this grief deliberately, 250,000 instances of it, and then destroyed the records that might have eased it. That's not an accident. That's not poor record keeping. That's a choice. Someone looked at the system and said, make sure they can never find each other. Make sure the grief persists. Make sure the questions remain unanswered. Why? If you plot the orphan train routes on a map, a pattern emerges. Children flowed from eastern urban centers, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, to rural areas in the Midwest and West, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, even as far as Texas and Montana. Now overlay that map with immigration patterns from 1850, 1880. The eastern cities were receiving waves of immigrants, Irish fleeing famine, Germans fleeing revolution, Italians and Polish and Russian Jews seeking economic opportunity. These communities clustered in specific neighborhoods, maintained languages, built churches and mutual aid societies. The orphan train children came overwhelmingly from these communities, and they were sent to areas that were predominantly Protestant, English-speaking, established American farm communities. The children didn't just move geographically, they moved culturally, linguistically, religiously. An Irish Catholic child sent to a Lutheran farm family in Kansas. An Italian-speaking child sent to a German Protestant family in Nebraska. A Yiddish-speaking child sent to a Methodist family in Iowa. The children were young enough to forget their original languages, to lose their religious practices, to assimilate completely into their new contexts. Within a generation, the cultural continuity of immigrant communities could be broken. Remove enough children, scatter them far enough, rename them thoroughly enough, and you can dilute or dissolve an entire ethnic community's ability to maintain itself. Was that the point? I can't prove it. The evidence was destroyed, but the pattern is there, and the timing matches the peak of nativist anxiety about immigrant populations overwhelming American culture. The orphan train system could have kept children in their communities, could have placed them with families of the same background, could have maintained cultural and religious continuity. It didn't. That was a choice. Beyond the individual tragedies, the separated families, the erased identities, the brutal labor, the early deaths, there's a larger loss. We lost the ability to trust the historical record, because if this could happen, 250,000 children systematically taken, renamed, scattered, with all documentation destroyed, what else was erased? How much of what we think we know about immigration, about urbanization, about the settling of the Midwest, is built on these silences? The history books talk about westward expansion, about farming communities growing, about assimilation and the melting pot. They don't talk about the organized dispersal of immigrant children as a tool of that expansion and assimilation. They don't talk about it because the records aren't there to talk about. And when the records aren't there, the history becomes whatever the institutions say it was. well-intentioned charity, rescue from poverty, a product of its time. But the steel rings on the station walls remember something else. The court cases where children couldn't prove their identities remember something else. The edited photographs with siblings removed remember something else. The mothers who spent their lives searching remember something else. The children who are still looking. In 2015, a DNA testing company started getting unusual requests. People whose families had told them vague stories about adoption or orphan trains wanted to use genetic testing to find biological relatives. A few successes were reported. A woman in Minnesota discovered she had a half-sister in Pennsylvania. Both had been separated as children and sent west in 1892. Neither had known the other existed until DNA connected them at ages 89 and 86. But most searches fail. The genetic cousins who show up in databases often don't know their own family histories. The immigrant communities the children came from are too dispersed now, and if the child was very young when taken, they might not know even basic information like their original surname or city of origin. The technology exists now that didn't exist for Margaret Doyle in 1867, but it's still not enough to overcome the systematic erasure of a century ago. I spoke with a genealogist who specializes in orphan train cases. She told me the hardest part isn't the science, it's the absence of documentary starting points. I need something to anchor a search, she said. A name, a date, a place. But if all three were changed and the records destroyed, DNA just tells me the person has Irish ancestry or Polish ancestry. That's not enough. There were millions of Irish immigrants, millions of Polish. Finding one family line out of millions with no documentary trail? It's nearly impossible. How many of your searches succeed? She paused, looked at her records. Maybe 5%, and those are usually cases where someone kept a letter, or a photograph with a location written on the back, or some fragment that survived. The rest, she shook her head, the rest stay lost. At 73, Eleanor was still looking. At 89, the Minnesota woman was still looking, and the great-grandchildren of the children who were taken are still looking. 100 years later, still trying to recover what was stolen. I'm standing on a train platform again. Same smell of diesel and rain. But it's Grand Central, present day, and the children passing through are on school field trips, tourist families, commuters. None of them know what this building remembers. I think about the children who stood here, who were told they were going to better lives, who clutched those small cloth bundles containing everything they'd been allowed to keep, who watched their city disappear through train windows and didn't know they'd never see it again. I think about the parents who were told it was temporary, who signed papers they couldn't read, who returned to claim their children and were told there was no record, no child, no legal claim, no recourse. I think about the system that orchestrated this, the bureaucrats who designed Protocol 7, the agents who edited photographs to remove siblings, the archivists who destroyed records on schedule, the lawyers who crafted the legal framework that made children unclaimable. They built a machine for erasing families, and they ran it for 75 years. And then they destroyed the evidence. But the machine's work persists. In the DNA searches that go nowhere, in the family stories with gaps nobody can fill, in the cemeteries across the Midwest where children with changed names lie buried far from anyone who knew their original selves. 250,000 children, 250,000 families, deliberately separated, systematically erased, and we're told it was charity. I look down at the platform. Those steel rings are still there, rusted into the concrete. Nobody remembers what they were for, but the building knows. The buildings always know. And somewhere, in forgotten archives and sealed repositories, in basements and filing cabinets nobody's opened in decades, the actual records might still exist. Protocol 7 might be explained. The Federal Bureau for Child Migration's files might be found. The truth might be recoverable. But only if someone keeps looking. Only if someone refuses to accept the official story. Only if someone believes the children and the parents and the grief that has no resolution. The train is pulling out. Somewhere, someone is still searching for a family they can't quite remember. Somewhere, a photograph with edited shadows is waiting to be examined closely. Somewhere, the evidence persists. It's not over. It won't be over until we find the truth they tried so hard to bury. The platform is empty now. Just me and the steel rings, and the memory of all those small hands that were tied there so they wouldn't run. They wanted to run. They should have been allowed to run, back to their mothers, back to their names, back to the lives they were supposed to live. But someone decided otherwise. And somewhere, in an archive nobody's been allowed to see, the paperwork explaining why still exists. I'm going to find it.